You mentioned the local, the relevance of the local level for migration, particularly integration, and we have worked quite a bit on that. But today, I want to talk about the European frame. Could you please show the first slide? The European scene, the European migration policy, and the refugee crisis. Because I think what we find here in Lesbos, which I am not very familiar with yet, can only be understood in the context of European migration and refugee policies. And the goal of my contribution is to describe and explain some fundamentals of European migration policy, its emergence and development, and the challenges it faces at present, particularly in view of the refugee crisis. It will also be necessary to sketch some major patterns of irregular migration into the EU in the 21st century and the political answers given to these migrations. And the perspective taken in my report is that of the EU and national governments trying to steer and control international migration. I think this is a necessary perspective. I mean, I work myself with refugees at home, etc., but the perspective that I take here is a bit different. I start with some structural, or even one could say logical aspects of EU migration policy that can help us understand very many concrete and often changing single items of this policy. These general considerations have to do with, first of all, the relationship of the single national state in the EU, to the European Union, and second, some logical aspects of European migration policy development in the context of the European Union integration process itself, that is, the changing from the European community, as it was founded in 1957, into the European Union. 3 further remarks. When I talk about migrants, I mean migrants in general who do not discern much between refugees and other groups that are mostly coming for improving their lives. We'll not talk much about technological aspects because other experts are here. And when I mean migration, a term which is sometimes used in the double sense of people moving across borders, but at the same time then meaning the process of integration, I will really concentrate on the aspect of crossing borders. Now, about this first aspect, nation state and EU policy. Of course, it is not easy to describe what the EU is. It is easier to describe what it is not. The EU certainly is not a multinational state or even a federation of states. Perhaps it is best to describe the EU as an alliance of national states with common institutions for the solution of common problems. Among these common institutions, the European Commission, the European Parliament, the European judiciary are major players, but the main influence remains still with the national states. So the Council of Ministers or the Council of the Heads of States are those institutions that have most influence, and that is still the nation states are playing the music. Nation states generally aspire to remain sovereign. The definition of who belongs to the state's population and who may enter and reside on the national territory are fundamental aspects of national state sovereignty. It is the function of administration judiciary, the police, and even the military to protect this aspect of sovereignty. The border is not only a physical and legal entity, but also a symbolic representation of this sovereignty. The nation states, however, when confronted with the social phenomenon of international migration, find themselves in a situation where the classical means of migration control alone are not sufficient anymore. They realize that there is a need for cooperation across borders with other states. In the EU, in particular, with the completion of the common market, major aspects of classical control functions had to be delegated to common institutions like the common Schengen visa system. Greek authorities, for instance, may issue Schengen visa which allow foreign nationals to enter German territory. Nation states have not given up their wish to remain sovereign when they join the EU, but they have to balance this with the need to cooperate and give up some of it in order, we say in German, the nation states are torn between Souveränitätsbeharren und Kooperationszwang. That means their wish to remain sovereign and the necessity to cooperate. To keep control, they have to give up some of it at the national level and delegate it to other national states and to common institutions. The need to cooperate is true for the relations with non-EU states as well. This is the first sort of general consideration that has to do with migration policy. The second one has to do with completing the common market. That is the process from the European Community to the European Union. Because when the European Community was founded in 1957, it was a purely economic community. And only sort of in a few steps, this development towards a union in the present sense developed. And the first step was in 1974, the proclamation of the EU as a Europe of citizens. In 1987, the EU announced the project of a common market for the free flow of goods, persons, services, and capital. This goal had far-reaching implications. When the Schengen Agreement, that is the promise for the free flow of persons, finally led to the removal of border controls between states, the logical implications was that the Schengen countries had gotten a common border with non-Schengen and non-EU countries. The Greek border with Turkey has become Germany's border with Turkey as well. The control of borders as a formerly fundamental aspect of single national sovereignty has become a common matter. Border and migration control shifted from the only national to the national and common levels. Other logical implications of the removal of internal border controls relate to asylum. When asylum applicants and recognized persons would be able to move without border controls at EU territories, at least three challenges will have to be met. First, avoiding asylum migration between states, for avoiding the concentration in EU countries with the more favorable living conditions, then avoiding asylum applications in several states, that is asylum shopping as it is called, and then avoiding the refugee in orbit phenomenon, that is that states keep sending migrants from one country to the other without anyone feeling responsible. The Dublin rules, identifying the responsibility of states for proceeding asylum application cases, were the political answer to these logically arising challenges. This is not to say, however, that the Dublin rules in their present forms were or are still an adequate or even just answer to these challenges, and I'll come back a little later to that. Now about the emergence of an EU migration policy. which, as I hope to have shown, is on the one hand driven by a certain logic of wanting to have free movement of persons, and secondly, is embedded in the European integration process itself. Now, could you please show the first slide? The slide shows the steps in the emergence of the European migration policy. I mean, I mentioned already the proclamation of a Europe of citizens, which is kind of getting away from the only economic understanding of the European Union, and then to the goal in 1987 of the free flow of goods, persons, services, and capital. Schengen II then in 1990, with the removal of border controls between countries, that has to be mentioned, was still a multilateral intergovernmental accord, since migration policy was not yet a competence of the EU. However, the European Union Act of 1993 changed the Maastricht Treaty, changed this and made immigration or migration policy for the first time a common matter. The Amsterdam Treaty then integrated the Schengen agreements into European law. The Schengen Information System, just to mention a technical aspects, is a base for the Schengen visa system. In the present refugee crisis, there's a feeling very often that the EU is a rather weak institution that has not been able to implement its policies. There's even the fear that the EU may disintegrate over migration policy issues. Looking at EU migration policy from a chronological and historic perspective, however, important steps or milestones can be identified in the development of an EU migration policy. And if you could show the second slide. The Tampere, that is a Finnish meeting, the Tampere Council in 1999 not only established the basis for an EU integration policy, but in addition set the goal of building a common asylum system, for being able to recognize the responsibility of states for an individual asylum case according to the Dublin Convention. The Eurodac fingerprint system was installed in 2000. The year 2003 saw two directives that had to be transposed into national law and that are truly important for third country nationals. That is Directive 86 from 2003 and from the same year Directive 109, which is the 36 is for the reunification of families, and the 109 is for permanent residence status. The realization of having common borders was an important factor for establishing Frontex in 2004 as an organization for coordinating national border control operations. Risk analysis and training of border are other Frontex activities. Tasks and resources of Frontex have been continuously increased, but it's interesting that EU states, and this is, this is the topic of wanting to remain sovereignty, still are not ready to create a common institution, but only an institution for coordinating national activities. Another sort of milestone in the European migration policy was the Blue Card of 2009, which gives a legal frame for the recruitment and legal immigration of highly qualified labor. But again, the decision about the condition of its application in the national labor markets, however, remain with the single states. The Tampere summit, as we said, had set the goal of building a common asylum system and had probably underestimated the problems. The Directive 95 from 2011 finally defined criteria for recognizing refugee or subsidiary status for applicants, and Directive 32 of 2013 is about common procedures for granting protection status according to the 2011 directive. These directives, however, do not include common standards for providing health and social services and access to the labor market, and I think this has very concrete local and national connotations for our case here on the island. Since it has not been possible so far to establish a European Asylum Authority, though the EU is working at that, a process of developing a set of common practices has been started with the European Asylum Support System, EASO. Its main task is to support for building and raising the quality of asylum systems, specifically in new member states, creating common information sources about countries of origin of asylum is one important activity of EASO. Another major point of EU migration policy is what has been called the exterritorialization of borders. This is a policy by which a country of origin of migrants or transit countries agrees to stop migrants on their way to EU borders. Spain has such an agreement with Morocco, and there are plans for such agreements at the EU level by the European Commission and single politicians, for instance also of Macron. Elements of such policy are also to be found in the EU-Turkey agreement of 2016. Colette from the Migration Policy Institute describes it as follows, I quote, "At its core, the agreement aims to address the overwhelming flow of smuggled migrants and asylum seekers traveling across the Aegean from Turkey to the Greek islands by allowing Greece to return to Turkey all new irregular migrants arriving after March 20. In exchange, EU member states will increase resettlement of Syrian refugees residing in Turkey, accelerate visa liberalization for Turkish nationals, and boost existing financial support for Turkey's refugee population." End of quote. And personally, I hope that I will learn, and we will learn a bit more what's the state of affairs now in relation to this EU-Turkey agreement. My final point is about the crisis and challenges. The present refugee crisis has been preceded by cases of unwanted irregular migration into the EU that have led to political and practical reactions of countries concerned. When Spain and Morocco, for instance, cooperated to stop irregular migration across the Western Mediterranean, smugglers opened up new routes from West Africa to the Canary Islands. In 2006, about 32,000 migrants used this route to come to Spain and into the EU. Surveillance of the sea, agreements between Spain and Mauritania and Senegal involving common police patrols by Spanish and Mauritanian forces put an end to this route. And a final slide, which I'm not going to interpret in detail, shows for the year 2014 or the changes of migration, irregular migration into the EU and different routes in the year 2014 and 2015. The closing of the West African route led to the opening up of the so-called Central Mediterranean route from Libya, which is still relevant. The war in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria made the Eastern Mediterranean and the so-called West Balkan route the most frequented way of migrants into the EU in 2015 and 16. On the whole, 2.7 million migrants arrived in the EU in 2015-16, creating a crisis situation in several countries. 2/3 of the migrants came to Germany, where local policies and resources were almost completely occupied with providing for the refugees during these times. The crisis revealed severe weaknesses of the EU migration policy and made obvious the following challenges. I just name them and then interpret them a bit in detail. A dilemma at the borders, the injustice of the Dublin system, not keeping the Dublin rules, majority rule decisions that do not work, lack of solidarity among EU states, and ethical issues. The dilemma at the border, effectively controlling the common borders is a prerequisite for the functioning of the Schengen system with the free movement of people in the EU. People arriving at EU borders with the free movement of people, people arriving at EU borders without a visa and asking for asylum or refugee protection, however, cannot simply be turned back, but according to directives 2011-95 and 2013-32, have a right for an investigation of their claims and thus have to be let in. If the Eurodac system indicates that the applicant has first arrived in another EU country, the Dublin rules prescribe that the person is sent there for the investigation of the claim. The same applies for irregular migrants who are already in the country and then ask for protection. Now about the failure of Dublin. The Dublin system rules that the country first entered by an asylum seeker is responsible for the asylum process. Since the huge majority of migrant and smuggler routes lead into Mediterranean EU countries, these are overburdened with the reception and asylum process. This has, in the case of Greece, been recognized by Germany, but in general, the southern countries help themselves by only partially using the Eurodac system and by letting many migrants go. The Dublin rules clearly are unjust and undermine the readiness of states suffering from it to keep the rules. The number of persons sent back to the country of arrival, according to the Dublin rules, is, however, very small. The failure of Dublin then leads not only to an overburdening of the Mediterranean countries, but also to an overburdening of the migrants' favorite countries like Sweden, Germany, and Austria. Norway, I'm not so sure about the numbers. Now, the problem with the majority principle in the EU. To overcome the problems with the rule of unanimous votes in the EU, the EU has introduced the possibility, that was in 2009, the possibility of majority decisions in some fields, not in all fields, including, however, migration policy. There has been a majority vote then for the relocation of refugees in 2015, but it is not implemented by the states. There's a serious lack of solidarity among EU states, particularly on the part of the new Eastern European states. The EU can do little to sanction this behavior. In 2015, for instance, the EU Commission started legal action against 19 member states for violating EU asylum law, but without much success. Now, my very final point is about ethical issues. And I start with the somewhat provocative proposition, and I'm very conscious of that, and perhaps I can be seriously attacked on that, but we are here for a discussion. I start with the proposition that European countries are not able to keep the promises that are incorporated in asylum and refugee convention laws derived from the European Human Rights Convention and the concept of asylum. And why is this so? Global inequalities structures, the globalization of communication with changing expectations about what a decent life is, and the easing of transportation have created a huge migration potential in many parts of the world. Wars, political repression, environmental catastrophes, and other events anytime may increase this migration potential. Millions of people are planning to come to Europe, and hundreds of thousands have already started their journey. It is estimated that presently more than 1 million people, for instance, are stranded in Libya alone. Development policies, fighting smugglers, information campaigns, and other methods against the culture of emigration in the countries of origin may have an effect only in a long-term perspective. In 1991, 92, and in 2015, 2016, local authorities in Germany, for instance, found themselves in a situation perhaps similar to what has been happening here in this island, where for months, when providing for asylum seekers and refugees and their needs was about the only activity they could engage in. Regular business almost stopped for certain parts of the administration. Despite tens of thousands of volunteers helping, without their engagement, the situation would have much more difficult. Due to the non-refoulement principle and the foundation of asylum and refugee law on the European Human Rights Convention, people cannot be turned back at the border when they ask for asylum or refugee protection. They have a right, as I said, for an investigation of their claim. They have a right for an asylum or refugee convention procedure. For the countries in which they arrive, this entails a large number of consequences, providing for the migrants, keeping a bureaucratic organization and a judiciary for investigating the protection claims, organizing language courses and schooling for the young, and of course housing. Of course, not all countries do this, but there are quite a few people who do provide in this way for the migrants. Many material and psychological resources have to be mobilized and invested for the process. The consent of the native population has to be won, increasingly with little success, however. In the end, not only those people whose claims have been recognized will stay, but the large majority as well of those whose claims have not been recognized. The critical point in all of this is numbers. With small numbers, there's hardly any problem with what I have just described, at least in those Western European countries that have experience with immigration. With very large numbers and mass migration of hundreds of thousands or millions of migrants, and the factual distortion of the institution of asylum, the situation completely changes. A struggle for scarce resources sets in, and with it the danger of structural and socio-psychological conflict between the newcomers and the native population, and of course also within the native population. The mobilization and political organization of nationalism, racism, hate, intolerance, and violence is a predictable consequence which threatens the social cohesion of European societies. Thus, European societies find themselves in a dilemma between wanting to uphold the institution of asylum and refugee protection on the one hand, and on the other hand, wanting to uphold the social cohesion and stability of their society. Even the very stability of the European Union herself seems to be threatened in the present migration crisis. Not protesting against barbed wire at some of the EU borders by the EU Commission and European councils and governments, cooperating with questionable countries like Turkey, Morocco, and other African states to keep unwanted migrants away from EU borders indicates that the promises of the universally proclaimed institution of asylum and refugee protection cannot and are not kept in practice. A process of relativizing human rights institutions has set and cannot be avoided unless the stabilities of our own societies is disregarded. Thank you for your attention. I know this has been provocative, but I think it's necessary to lead this discussion. Thank you very much.